Most people will go their entire lives without witnessing an unexplained phenomenon. Some search for UFOs, others hunt for Bigfoot. Me? I watched my wife Sydney spend one weekend on the internet and come back convinced she should be running our marriage like a Fortune 500 company. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm the boss in this marriage." Apparently, she'd spent 2 days studying powerful women, successful matriarchal families, and all the reasons husbands shouldn't be trusted with important decisions. What followed was the most ridiculous experiment our marriage ever endured. Let me start from the beginning. To understand what happened, you first need to understand Sydney. Sydney has never, in all the years I've known her, encountered a problem she didn't want to manage. Not just solve, manage. There's a difference. Solving a problem means you fix it and move on. Managing a problem means you create a color-coded tracking system for it, schedule a weekly check-in about it, and build a contingency plan in case the original plan fails. If you left Sydney alone on a deserted island, she wouldn't just survive. She'd have an org chart by Tuesday. By Thursday, the coconut trees would be on a performance improvement plan. Most of the time, this energy had a healthy outlet. Her colleagues loved her. Her bosses praised her. And I, her husband of 4 years, got to come home to a woman who had already alphabetized the spice rack and sent a follow-up email about it. It worked. We worked. Our marriage had a rhythm. Then I made the mistake of going on a 3-day business trip. I want to be clear. It was a completely ordinary trip. 2 nights in a hotel with bad pillows and a breakfast buffet where the scrambled eggs had that particular sadness only hotel scrambled eggs can achieve. Nothing dramatic happened. I went, I sat in meetings, I flew home. I landed on Sunday evening, exhausted in that specific way where even your eyelids feel heavy. All I wanted was a shower, a couch, and a solid hour of not thinking about anything. I pictured the couch. I practically heard the couch calling my name. I put my bag down by the front door. Sydney was already in the kitchen, and the moment she turned around, I knew. I don't know how to describe it exactly. There's a certain look a person gets when they've been thinking very hard about something for a very long time, and they're finally, at last, going to tell you about it. It's somewhere between excitement and the expression a prosecutor makes right before they present evidence. Sydney had that look. "We need to talk," she said. Those 4 words, the 4 most terrifying words in the English language. Not because they guarantee disaster, but because they guarantee length. Nothing good has ever immediately followed, "We need to talk." No one has ever sat their spouse down and said, "We need to talk. I hid $500 in your jacket pocket." It doesn't work that way. I sat down at the kitchen table. That's when I noticed the accessories. A notepad. Several printed pages. Printed, as in she had walked to an actual printer, which we only use twice a year. And a thick marker, uncapped and standing upright in her hand like a conductor's baton. I looked at the notepad. I looked at the marker. I looked at my wife. "How long is this going to take?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just looked at me with the calm, focused energy of someone who had rehearsed this moment, possibly multiple times, possibly in the mirror. Then she said it. "I'm the boss in this marriage." I'm not proud of what happened next. My brain short-circuited and sent the wrong signal to my face, which began preparing a laugh. I actually had to physically bite the inside of my cheek. Hard. Because nothing about Sydney's expression suggested that laughter was going to be well received. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't joking. She was staring at me with the flat, steady confidence of a CEO, announcing a restructuring plan to a room full of middle managers who definitely did not ask for this. I swallowed the laugh, took a breath, and said, as neutrally as I possibly could, "Okay, and what exactly does that mean?" That was apparently the opening she'd been waiting for. Over the next 20 minutes, and I timed this mentally, because time starts moving differently when your wife is delivering a PowerPoint presentation without the PowerPoint, Sydney explained her new theory of marriage. Every successful organization, she said, needs a clear leader. Look at any company. There's a CEO. Look at any sports team. There's a captain. Look at any military unit. there's a general. The hierarchy exists for a reason. Decisions get made faster. Accountability is clear. Efficiency improves. Therefore, she had concluded, our marriage needed a boss. And she had, by pure coincidence I'm sure, selected herself for the position. Her reasoning? Years of corporate experience, strong organizational instincts, and, she mentioned with what I can only describe as suspicious casualness, the fact that I had just spent 3 days away doing who knows what, while she had been here thinking very clearly about the structure of our household. I held up a hand. Can I ask a question? Of course, she said, like a CEO graciously opening the floor to questions from a confused junior employee. Aren't marriages supposed to involve compromise? Like, two people working things out together? Where are you even getting this matriarchal family information? She waved this away. Research. What research? Extensive research. From where? She gave me a look that said the source of the research was not currently up for discussion, and moved on. I tried another angle. Has anyone actually studied whether families where one person makes all the decisions are happier? Because off the top of my head, that sounds less like a marriage and more like a particularly emotional dictatorship. It's not a dictatorship, she said, in a tone that I'm fairly certain dictators also use. It's leadership. What's the difference? I'll explain it to you later when we have more time. At one point, she looked up and met my eyes, and I had this vivid, specific mental image of Napoleon Bonaparte standing on top of a kitchen table, one hand on his jacket lapel, one fist raised toward the ceiling, delivering an inspirational speech to troops who had absolutely not signed up for this particular campaign. I was the troops. I thought about pointing out that Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed, but decided this was not the moment. So, I finally said, to summarize, you watched a bunch of videos this weekend, and you've decided you're in charge now. I prefer chief decision maker, she said. Of course you do. And yes, starting this week. I sat there for a moment, trying to trace the logical chain of events that had brought me here. I had gotten on a plane. I had eaten bad eggs. I had done nothing unusual or provocative. I had come home. And somewhere between my departure on Thursday and my return on Sunday, my marriage had been reorganized without my input, which, I want to note, is a pretty significant decision to make without the other person involved. I thought about arguing more. I thought about laying out a firm, rational counterposition, but Sydney was already uncapping a second color of marker, and honestly, I was too tired. Fine, I said, but I want it on the record that I have objections. Noted, she said, in a tone that made it abundantly clear my objections had been received and placed directly into a folder labeled Not Relevant. I went and got a shower, and as I stood there under the warm water, staring at the tile, I made a silent promise to myself. This was going to last exactly as long as it needed to, before collapsing completely under its own weight. I just didn't know yet how entertaining the collapse was going to be. The next morning, Sydney called an all-hands meeting. The all-hands meeting was just the two of us sitting at the kitchen table, but she had the energy of someone addressing a quarterly earnings call. I had coffee. She had a notepad, which I was starting to understand was load-bearing to her entire management philosophy. She announced, with the calm confidence of someone who had definitely not second-guessed themselves at any point overnight, that the new system would operate on 3 foundational principles. She makes the decisions. She gives the directives. She bears the responsibility. I nodded slowly at each one, the way you nod when someone explains something that sounds reasonable on the surface, but has a structural problem you can already see from 3 miles away. The third point, she bears the responsibility, I found particularly interesting. I stored it quietly in the back of my mind, like a receipt you keep because you have a feeling you might need to return something. I said nothing. Here's the thing about Sydney's plan that I want to be fair about. The logic wasn't completely insane. Clear leadership, defined roles, efficient decision-making. In a company? Sure. In a military unit? Absolutely. In a marriage between two adults who share a Netflix account and argue about whose turn it is to clean the bathroom, the architecture gets a little shakier, but I kept that observation to myself because I'd made a decision of my own. I was going to let this play out. Not out of spite. Well, not entirely out of spite, but out of genuine scientific curiosity. I wanted to see what happened when Sydney got everything she was asking for. Full authority, full responsibility, full control of the ship. I was going to be the best employee Sydney Incorporated had ever seen. So I sat there across from her, hands folded, expression neutral, and said, "Understood. What are my assignments for today?" She slid a handwritten list across the table. I picked it up. I read it. I put it back down. "Sydney." "Yes?" I'm counting 6 things." 7, she corrected. "The windows count as separate from the general cleaning." The list was, in order: vacuum the entire house, dust every surface, mop the floors, clean the bathroom, wipe down the kitchen, wash the windows, drive to the grocery store and stock up for the full week, and have a home-cooked dinner ready by the time she returned from work. I want to pause here and say something. In our marriage, household tasks have always been divided more or less evenly, not through any formal agreement, just through the natural rhythm of two people who live together and aren't monsters. I vacuum, she mops. I cook Tuesdays and Thursdays, she cooks Wednesdays and Sundays. It works. It's never been a source of conflict. What was now sitting in front of me was essentially our entire monthly cleaning schedule compressed into a single Tuesday. I looked up at her. Quick question. Why have all of the household tasks suddenly become exclusively mine? Sydney put her coffee mug down and gave me the kind of patient, measured look that managers give employees when they're about to deliver feedback the employee isn't going to enjoy. "Tyler," she said, "effective leadership requires enormous cognitive investment. I'm now responsible for the strategic direction of this household, the big picture thinking, the long-term planning, the decision architecture." She picked up her mug again. "I simply don't have the bandwidth for operational details." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. Operational details. Mopping the floor was now an operational detail. "So," I said carefully, "you promoted yourself to CEO and simultaneously eliminated your own domestic responsibilities. That's the structure we've landed on. I prefer chief decision-maker." I remember. She stood up, grabbed her bag, kissed me on the cheek with the cheerful efficiency of someone who absolutely did not feel any guilt about what had just happened, and walked out the front door. I sat at the kitchen table. I stared at the list. I finished my coffee. And then I thought about it clearly, the way a sensible person thinks about a problem when they have no emotional stake in the method, only the outcome. The list said the house needed to be clean. It did not specify who had to clean it. The list said groceries needed to be purchased. It did not specify the acquisition method. The list said dinner needed to be home-cooked and delicious. Well, 2 of those 3 were achievable. I picked up my phone. The cleaning company arrived by 9:30. 2 very efficient people who did in 90 minutes what would have taken me the better part of the day and left the place smelling genuinely cleaner than it had in months. I watched from the couch with my laptop and felt something I can only describe as managerial satisfaction. The grocery delivery landed on our doorstep at 11. I had even been thoughtful about it, not just basics, but things Sydney actually liked. The good yogurt. The specific brand of sparkling water she pretends isn't expensive. The little acts of delegation that really show you care. Dinner was the most creative solution of the 3. There's a place about 10 minutes from our house that describes itself as soul food made like your mother's. It's the kind of restaurant where everything tastes like someone who loves you made it, which is technically the same effect as home cooking, just produced by professionals who are much better at it than I am. I ordered 3 dishes, portioned them into our own bowls, arranged everything on the stove like it had been cooking there. By noon, I was on the couch, beer in hand, watching television. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who looks for loopholes. I am not someone who tries to technically satisfy requirements while violating the spirit of them. I believe in honest communication and good faith effort. But Sydney had structured our marriage as a corporation. And in a corporation, you don't do everything yourself. You build systems. You leverage resources. You delegate. Every business school in America will tell you that a good manager doesn't do. A good manager enables. I was enabling the heck out of this household. When Sydney came home that evening, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at the clean floors, the spotless counters, the gleaming windows. She walked to the kitchen and saw the stove, and whatever was sitting in those bowls apparently smelled incredible because her whole face changed. "Tyler," she said, setting her bag down slowly. This looks amazing." "Thank you," I said from the couch. She picked up a spoon and tasted something. Her eyes closed briefly. "This is divine. Did you make this yourself?" I smiled. I said nothing, which technically is not lying. She sat down to eat and, midway through, looked up at me with genuine warmth and said, "You know, I think this is already working. I've only been in charge for one day and look at the results. The house is perfect. The food is incredible." She gestured around with her fork. "This is exactly what strong leadership produces." I nodded. "Absolutely," I said. She beamed. And I sat there very quietly, watching my wife take full credit for a clean house she hadn't cleaned, groceries she hadn't bought, and a dinner she hadn't cooked, all of which had been produced by a system I'd built in about 45 minutes while watching 3 episodes of a show she'd told me not to start without her. I didn't say a word. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear the distant faint sound of her third rule beginning to develop a problem. She bears the responsibility. The question was just, responsible for what, exactly? That part was coming. Somewhere around day 3 of Sydney's management era, I started thinking about how this whole thing actually began. It wasn't the videos, not really. The videos were just the match. And I'd been watching the kindling build for months. Sydney had been talking about work differently lately, more carefully, more often. Her department head had announced he was leaving the company, and leadership was going to be selecting a replacement. The position was, by any objective measure, Sydney's to lose. She had the experience, she had the track record, she had the kind of organized, decisive energy that made companies want to hand her a bigger budget and a team to run. She wanted it badly. I could tell because she mentioned it casually, the way people mention things they're actually consumed by. One evening, she was walking me through the dynamics of her office. Who was being considered? Who had the political relationships? Whether her most recent project had landed the way she'd hoped? And somewhere in the middle of it, something clicked into place for me. She wasn't just experimenting with being the boss of our marriage. She was practicing. Some part of Sydney's brain, the part that had watched too many videos about powerful women and matriarchal households while I was gone, had decided that leading our marriage was professional development. She'd absorbed a bunch of content that told her decisive female leadership produces results. She was facing the most important career moment in years. And she'd come home and done what Sydney always does when she's anxious about something. She built a system around it. Our marriage had become her unpaid management internship. I sat with that realization for a while. And I'll be honest, there was a version of this where I felt genuinely bad about it, where I sat her down and said, "Hey, you seem stressed? Let's talk about what's actually going on." That version of me exists, but a different version of me had been doing research. Because if Sydney wanted to run a corporation, I was going to be the most authentically corporate employee she had ever encountered in her life. My job had always given me a lot of independence, no rigid office structure, no chain of approvals, mostly just me making my own calls, which meant I'd had to study for this. I spent an evening going through workplace forums, Reddit threads from middle managers, advice columns for people navigating difficult office dynamics. Hours of material. And buried in all of it, I found the single most elegant piece of workplace knowledge known to mankind. It's called malicious compliance, or in the gentler corporate phrasing, Strict adherence to instructions. The concept is simple. You don't argue. You don't push back. You follow every directive exactly as given, to the letter, without using any independent judgment whatsoever, because your role, as a direct report, is not to think. It's to execute. All thinking flows from leadership. Sydney wanted to make the decisions? Perfect. I was going to need a decision on everything. It started the next morning. Hey, I need to get some stuff from the store. Which laundry detergent should I buy? Sydney was eating breakfast. She looked up. Just get the usual one. Which one is the usual one? The blue one. There are several blue ones. I'll need you to be more specific. She told me the brand. I thanked her and said I'd follow up with additional questions as they developed. 20 minutes later. The store doesn't have the large size, only medium or extra large. What's your preferred volume strategy here? She texted back the answer. I responded, understood. Also, we're having pizza tonight. Toppings? She sent toppings. I replied, great. Should I call the place on 5th or the one on Madison? Both are within the approved delivery radius. She answered. I waited 12 minutes and texted again. Quick follow-up. The bathroom faucet is dripping. I think we need a plumber. Do you want me to get quotes from multiple contractors, or do we have a preferred vendor? Also, what's the budget ceiling for this? I want to make sure any expenditure falls within authorized parameters. There was a longer pause this time. Then, just call whoever. I replied, I appreciate the directional guidance, but I'll need a more concrete authorization before committing household funds. Can you confirm approval in writing? The pause that followed was longer still. Here's the thing I want to say in my defense. I was not being unreasonable. Every single question I sent was legitimate. These were real decisions that came up in the natural course of running a household. Previously, I had made all of them myself without a second thought, because that's what adults in partnerships do. They absorb the small decisions, so neither person has to think about all of them simultaneously. But Sydney had restructured the organization. She had centralized decision-making at the executive level. I was simply operating within the system she had designed. By the end of the first week, her phone looked like it belonged to someone managing a small city. I was sending morning requests, midday clarifications, afternoon follow-ups, and occasional evening questions about whether a particular leftover could be considered dinner or required supplemental procurement. The real masterpiece, though, was the escalation protocol. If Sydney gave me a vague answer, I didn't interpret it charitably and move on. I sent a clarifying question. If her clarification was also vague, I sent another. The chain could go remarkably deep. Buy groceries for the week. What items? She'd send a list. Which brand of pasta? She'd name a brand. Large box or standard? She'd specify. Tyler, just use your judgment. And this was my favorite moment. Every single time, I would write back, with complete sincerity. I really appreciate you saying that, but as we discussed, judgment calls fall within the executive decision-making framework. I want to make sure I'm respecting the system we put in place. Can you confirm? She started responding in all caps around day 5. The timing of all this, I should mention, was not ideal for Sydney professionally, which I had not planned, but which the universe apparently had. She'd been put in charge of her department on a temporary trial basis. A 2-week audition. Leadership watching to see how she handled the responsibility. So Sydney was now, simultaneously, running a department of 12 people at work and managing a household employee who required written authorization to buy a light bulb. One Tuesday evening, she came through the front door, dropped her bag on the floor, not hung it, dropped it, and collapsed onto the couch with the specific heaviness of someone whose soul had partially left their body. I looked up from my book. Rough day? I got peppered with questions from my team from 9 to noon, she said, staring at the ceiling. Then my 1 o'clock ran 2 hours. Then, she closed her eyes. Then you. I put the book down, folded my hands, adopted my most supportive expression. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. I want you to know your leadership is felt. The team really values clear direction. She turned her head slowly to look at me. Quick question, I said. The fridge light has been flickering. Do I need written authorization to look into replacement options, or is this covered under the general maintenance clause? The look she gave me in that moment is genuinely difficult to describe. It was the look of a person who had built a machine, watched it run flawlessly, and only now was beginning to understand what it was going to cost to operate. She didn't say anything. She picked up a throw pillow and held it over her face for approximately 10 seconds. Then she put it down, straightened up and said, "I'm fine. I've got this. This is fine." She absolutely did not have this. But I had to admire the conviction. Sydney was not a person who conceded anything easily. She could be standing in the middle of a structural collapse and still insist the building was load-bearing. The experiment wasn't over yet, but I could hear the walls starting to creak. Fate, as it turns out, has a genuinely excellent sense of comedic timing. The day Sydney's experiment ended was my birthday. We'd planned this months in advance, a backyard barbecue, nothing elaborate. A handful of close friends, both sides of the family, decent food, cold drinks, the kind of evening that doesn't require a theme or a budget meeting, just people standing around a grill, being normal. What I had not planned was that this particular day would also be the single most professionally consequential day of Sydney's temporary management career. Her department's final presentation, the one that would determine the future of her entire team, the one that her company's actual leadership would be evaluating as part of her trial run, was scheduled for that afternoon, my birthday. I noticed when I woke up that Sydney was already moving through the house at a frequency I can only describe as pre-launch. She had the focused, slightly wild energy of someone who is simultaneously late for a flight, a job interview, and a meeting they forgot to prepare for. She was dressed, coffee in hand, laptop bag over her shoulder, and talking at a speed that suggested her brain was running several conversations ahead of her mouth. Before she left, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. "The party," she said. "I need you to handle it. All of it." Then she sighed and rubbed her forehead. "I know it's your birthday, and honestly, I hate this. I wanted to organize everything myself so you wouldn't have to worry about any of it. The whole point was for you to relax and enjoy the day." She glanced at the clock and let out another exhausted sigh. "But this project is a complete disaster right now. Half the team keeps asking questions, the client changed requirements 3 times this week, and my presentation is in a few hours." For a second, she looked genuinely guilty. "I'm sorry, Tyler. Really. I know this isn't fair. You shouldn't be spending your birthday setting up tables and dealing with coolers and grocery lists." She shook her head. "I'll be back as soon as I can. I just can't." She gestured broadly at everything. "You understand." I did understand. For the first time since this whole experiment started, Sydney didn't sound like the boss of the marriage. She sounded like a very tired woman who had just discovered that being in charge of everything wasn't nearly as glamorous as it looked from the outside. "Of course," I said pleasantly. "I'll follow proper procedure." Something crossed her face. A flicker of a warning she was too busy to act on. Then she kissed me, grabbed her keys, and left. I gave her 45 minutes. Enough time to get to the office, get settled, feel the pressure of the day fully descend on her. Then I started texting. "Quick question before I begin procurement. What kind of meat should I get for the grill? Need written authorization." 3 minutes later. "Noted. Follow-up. What beverages are we offering? I want to make sure the selection reflects the management vision." 6 minutes after that. "How many chairs should be set up? I can estimate based on guest count, but the final number feels like an executive call." Then, "Music preferences? Upbeat or relaxed? I have a playlist, but it hasn't been approved by leadership." Then, "Should I rearrange the patio furniture? There are a few configuration options. Happy to send diagrams." Then, "Napkins. Do we need extra napkins? This feels like a medium priority item, but I didn't want to make a unilateral call." My phone rang. I answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman who sounded like she was holding herself together with about 2 pieces of tape and a very firm commitment to professionalism. "Tyler." A pause. "Please, I'm begging you. Make a decision. Any decision. You're the boss now. I quit. I don't want to be the boss anymore. I cannot handle any more of this." I had to press my lips together very hard. Because this right here, was the moment I had been waiting for. The formal resignation I had absolutely not been engineering through 2 weeks of careful, deliberate, enthusiastically bureaucratic behavior. "Are you sure?" I asked. "This feels like an important leadership transition. Shouldn't we document it?" "Tyler, I just want to make sure the handover is—" "Tyler." I let her off the hook. "Go do your presentation," I said. "I've got everything here. Don't worry about any of it." She exhaled so hard I could feel it through the phone. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, "I've been getting questions all week, from the team at work. 12 people, Tyler. All of them with questions. And then I come home and you—" She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite despair, but existed somewhere in the middle. "I don't even know if I want the job anymore. I genuinely don't know if I want to be in charge of anything." Then she hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding my phone. Somewhere under all the comedy of the past 2 weeks, there was something real in what she'd just said. Sydney had wanted this promotion badly enough that she'd turned our marriage into a training ground for it. And somewhere in the process of actually doing the job, actually living what it meant to be responsible for every decision, every question, every outcome, the thing she'd been chasing had started to look different up close. I put the phone down and got to work, and got no delegation this time, no creative outsourcing. I drove to the store myself, picked out the food, carried it back, set up the yard, arranged the chairs, got the grill going, turned on music that I personally selected without submitting a proposal. By the time guests started arriving, everything was ready. The afternoon moved along the way good backyard parties do, slowly, warmly, with cold drinks and conversations that drift from one thing to another. My family on one side, our friends on the other, everyone gradually mixing. The grill was doing its job. The evening was doing its job. Sydney was not there yet. The sun had started its descent toward the roofline when I heard the gate. She came through it like a woman who had run at least part of the way from her car. Hair that had started the day in a neat professional arrangement and had since made its own decisions. Jacket slightly off axis. Eyes with the particular brightness of someone who has been operating at maximum capacity for 11 hours and is now running entirely on adrenaline and forward momentum. She was carrying a cake box. The box was listing to one side in a way that suggested the journey from the bakery had not been gentle. When she set it on the table and I opened it, I found a cake that had, at some point in its recent history, experienced significant turbulence. The frosting had migrated. Several decorative elements had relocated. It looked like a cake that had been in a minor accident and was trying not to talk about it. Sydney looked at the cake, then at me. "Happy birthday, honey," she said, with the specific energy of someone who is going to hold it together if it kills her. Then she reached into the cooler, pulled out the coldest beer available, and consumed it at a speed that drew a brief, impressed silence from the assembled guests. No one had ever seen Sydney drink like that. Sydney was a sip-and-savor person. Whatever had happened at that presentation had fundamentally recalibrated her relationship with hydration. She looked up, slightly breathless, and remembered. "The gift," she said. "It's at the office. I left it on my desk. I'll go get—" "Sydney," I put a hand on her arm. "The gift will still be there tomorrow." She looked at me, then at the yard full of people, then back at me. And something in her just settled. She went inside, changed out of her work clothes, came back out looking like herself again, and slid into the evening like she'd been there the whole time. Someone handed her a plate. Someone else pulled her into a conversation. The night did what good nights do. It absorbed her. But then, maybe an hour later, I noticed she was telling a story. I drifted closer and caught the thread. She was explaining to my aunt, of all people, who was listening with the fascinated expression of someone receiving information they absolutely did not expect. The entire sequence of events, the weekend videos, the announcement, the 3 rules, the notepad, the marker. I watched her telling it and realized she wasn't editing anything. She told them about the task list she'd left me on day 1 and about coming home to a perfect house and a divine dinner and feeling like a visionary, before pausing dramatically and admitting she had no idea how any of it had actually been achieved. She told them about her colleagues at work asking questions all day and then coming home to a husband who needed written authorization to check the fridge. She did the voice. She did my voice. I appreciate the directional guidance, but I'll need a more concrete authorization. People were laughing hard enough that someone had to put their plate down. And then Sydney laughed too. Really laughed. The full version, the one that involves her whole face and occasionally her shoulder. At some point she turned to me and said, in front of everyone, "You were right. It was a catastrophe." "I didn't say that," I said. "You were thinking it." "I was thinking it very loudly," I admitted. She shook her head, still smiling. "Leadership looks a lot better from the outside." She picked up her drink. "I had 12 people asking me things today. 12. And I sat there thinking, this is what I've wanted for years? This is the dream?" "What happened with the presentation?" I asked. "It went well," she said, in the slightly deflated tone of someone reporting good news that no longer feels as important as it did that morning. "They liked it. They'll probably offer me the job." "That's great." She looked at me. "Yeah," she said, not entirely convincingly. "Yeah, it is." Later that night, after the guests had gone and we were cleaning up the yard, Sydney stopped by the table and looked at the remains of the cake, still listing, still frosted in whatever direction gravity had taken it. "I want to formally resign," she said. I looked up. "From what?" "The position," she gestured. "Chief decision maker, boss of this marriage, all of it. Effective immediately. No transition period. I'll note that in the record." "I'm serious." She sat down on the edge of the table. "The old system was better. 2 people, both making decisions. Nobody filing requests for toothpaste." "I fully support this reorganization," I said. She pointed at me. "And you, what you did, that was absolutely diabolical. I was following the framework you established. You were a menace. I was an excellent employee." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed again, quietly, and said, "Thank you for showing me what it actually looked like." A few days later, Sydney was officially offered the department head position. She thought about it for a week. She turned it down. I didn't push her either way. It was her call, which felt like the appropriate word for it. She started figuring out what she actually wanted, separate from what she'd spent years thinking she was supposed to want. That turned out to be a longer conversation, and a better one. Our marriage went back to normal. The good kind of normal. 2 people making decisions together, splitting things without a spreadsheet, arguing about television like civilized adults. We kept exactly one thing from the experiment. Now, whenever Sydney gets that look, the organized, decisive, slightly presidential look, I wait for a pause in the conversation and say, very calmly, "Should I submit a formal request before opening the refrigerator? Or is that still covered under the General Access Clause?" And every single time, without fail, she laughs so hard she has to put whatever she's holding down. It's become our thing, which I think is better than a 3-rule management structure, by a considerable margin. Sydney is the best person I know, and I'm fairly confident that together we can survive anything life decides to throw at us. Ideally with humor, preferably in writing, for accountability purposes. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.